Ron Paul is a congressman from the 14th Congressional District of Texas. Having entered a bid for the Republican Party's nomination in the 2008 U.S. presidential election on the 8th of March 2008 after obtaining only 15 delegates out of 2,360, although he did garner 5.7% of the vote in the Republican primaries that year, Ron Paul loitered around the lunatic fringe before entering the 2012 Republican nomination process in 2010. He has recently been gaining popularity thanks to the work of his fanbase, affectionately known as Paulbots, Paultards, or Paulites, and most have, by now, seen the rabid shrieks of Ron Paul 2012. 1. At least once on the internet. Needless to say, if this surge actually turns out to be legitimate and he does face Barack Obama for the presidency, the United States will be in for one hell of a ride. Ron Paul is frequently described as a conservative with many libertarian ideas, which means that Ron Paul is a pro-libertarian/conservative. He is a strict constitutionalist and believes in limited government to the point of abolishing the I.R.S. and the income tax, most federal spending, reintroduce the gold standard, and abolish the Federal Reserve. Not to mention that would eliminate Medicare/Medicaid and castrate Social Security. He also voted against the Darfur Accountability and Divestment Act of 2007, which would have banned federal contracts with firms doing business with the Janjaweed militia of Sudan. He was the only congressman to do so. On the other hand, he also wants to end the war on drugs, supports medical marijuana, and wants to get the U.S. out of Iraq and Afghanistan. It has been suggested that Paul is in league with the Dominionist and Christian Reconstructionist movements. Paul introduced the We the People Act into the House of Representatives twice. This bill would strip the federal courts of jurisdiction in cases involving abortion, same-sex marriage, privacy related to sexual behavior, and Establishment Clause issues, leaving them to the states. Which is exactly what the religious right wants to do. Ron Paul ran for president on the Libertarian ticket in 1988, and obtained about 0.5% of the popular vote. His running mate Andre Marrow ran again in 1992 and obtained 0.28% of the popular vote. After this poor showing, Ron Paul went back to the GOP with his tail between his legs. There has been some controversy over support for Ron Paul by extremist groups, tax protesters, and neo-Nazi organizations such as Stormfront. In fact, Stormfront.org administrator and noted white nationalist Don Black donated $500 to Paul's campaign. Paul's campaign has expressed dismay over these associations, although critics hold that he has not adequately distanced himself from them. Ron Paul has also used his notability among fervent libertarians to endorse a number of candidates for office on more local level. One of the candidates he initially endorsed, Bill Johnson, turned out to be a white supremacist who had written a proposed constitutional amendment that would have deported people based on racial criteria. He endorsed the fundamentalist Chuck Baldwin of the Constitution Party in 2008 and in turn endorsed and was endorsed by noted crank Arthur Robinson. Following the recent TIA Act, he was the one standing up to say that taking nude photos of passengers, and feeling up people's grandmothers, is not making anyone safer. He proposed a simple law which would essentially say that government officials have to go through the same screenings the rest of us do, in an effort to wake them up. He has even spoken in defense of WikiLeaks, a whistleblowing website that has exposed government corruption. However, even in areas of foreign policy, Paul has demonstrated that he is not to be trusted. A month after 9/11, he proposed H.R. 3076, which would place a $40 billion bounty on top al-Qaeda members who were brought to the government dead or alive. Essentially, it would hire a group of private mercenaries to handle the Afghanistan war their own way. For some reason, he seems to not like the idea of jus soli, the granting of citizenship to those born in America. Ron Paul is attempting to run for the presidency a third time, and has gained more media attention than the first two times. Unfortunately for Paulbots, he has yet to win a single primary or caucus, though his supporters still insist that he is second in delegate count. Though his domestic policy views are hard to justify, it is amusing to see other Republican candidates getting owned on matters of foreign policy and gay marriage in the debates. Paul is associated with the Austrian School of Economics. Longtime Paul associate and staffer Lew Rockwell founded the Ludwig von Mises Institute, which runs columns by Paul. This is the reason for all of his gold buggery and other cranky economic ideas. He doesn't just want to audit and end the Fed, but also to audit Fort Knox's gold reserves, just in case someone replaced them with metal bars that are merely painted gold. On the positive side of the ledger, he was, along with Bernie Sanders of Vermont, a driving force behind the audit of the Fed that revealed its dirty dealings during the bailouts. Ron Paul's extremist views on states' rights extends into his beliefs on homosexuality. Ron Paul believes that these rights include the ability to regulate sex, specifically arresting homosexual individuals for having sex. This is another case where he abandons the right to privacy for a group he doesn't like. While he wants to abolish the death penalty at the federal level, apparently it doesn't matter when supporting extremist pastor Philip Kaiser, who advocates the death penalty for gays. Dr. Paul neither knows nor cares about science. He believes that a lack of understanding of basic science shouldn't matter in choosing a president. Although an MD, he has said evolution is just a theory and that he does not accept it. He's also a climate change denier. Soon after his election to Congress in 1978, Ron Paul began putting out a newsletter. Originally entitled the Ron Paul Freedom Report, then the Ron Paul Political Report, and finally the Ron Paul Survival Report, it was full of homophobia, racism, sexism, and paranoia. The Ron Paul Report was roughly equivalent to the John Birch Society in its kookishness. The report particularly seemed to hate Barbara Jordan, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela. Ron Paul has since said that he didn't write everything for the report, but a consistent pattern of writing for the better part of the late 80s and early 90s, that is, when the nuttiest stuff was printed in the newsletter, suggests that he at least knew what was in it. Movement libertarians have fingered Paul staffer Lew Rockwell as the culprit who ghost-wrote the reports. He predictably denies authorship of the letters as well. However, in previous interviews he has defended several of the statements as both being written by himself and being statistical instead of racist. Nelson Linder, former president of the Austin division of the NAACP, has known Ron Paul for over 20 years and vehemently denies that he is a racist, and in fact admires his work in defense of blacks in the criminal justice system. Naturally, the existence of a single African American who thinks Ron Paul isn't a racist proves that he indeed isn't. Ron Paul has made noises which suggest that he has backpedaled from the racism he embraced previously. Racism is simply an ugly form of collectivism, the mindset that views humans strictly as members of groups rather than individuals. The true antidote to racism is liberty. Liberty, a limited, constitutional government devoted to the protection of individual rights rather than group claims. Reconciling this with his views on homosexuality is left as an exercise for the reader. All of this, and considering he's an opponent of the Civil Rights Act, leaves us with a couple of theories as to why Ron Paul seems to be a magnet for nuts. He's desperate for supporters. He's horribly ignorant of who he has ties to. And/or he's a horrible bigot and doesn't want to admit it. Ron Paul was actually the first to start using the Tea Party iconography back in 2007 and during his money bomb days. In a massively ironic and hypocritical move, the Tobaggers ran multiple candidates against him in the 2010 midterms. In other words, Paul, who is an actual MD, supports freeing the chains that bind the sellers of quack remedies and unproven nostrums from lying to their potential customers. It is recommended that you go to the link in the footnote and read it. You can skip all the stuff about Stormfront and neo-Nazis to get to the quackery report. His son, Rand Paul, is a Republican senator from Kentucky. If anything, he's even crazier than Ron. Surprisingly, Rand Paul is apparently not named after libertarian icon Ayn Rand.